So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this talk on landscapes for Lepidoptera. As Simon has said, I'm the Conservation Manager for South East England at Butterfly Conservation. So the focus of today's talk will be on the South East region. I've always had quite a lifelong interest in butterflies, and in my previous roles have had lots to do with them to try and bring them to the forefront of different conservation management techniques across my previous positions. Now it's my job in the southeast of England to highlight butterflies and moths and bring about change for them at landscape scale across the different landscapes that we work across. So for a bit of background, some of you may already be familiar with butterfly conservation, as the majority of you here are probably members. But our strategy covers three key areas. The first is to halve the number of the UK's threatened species of butterflies and moths, which is an ambitious target, along with improve the condition of 100 of the most important landscapes for butterflies and moths. This is then supported by our third strategy element, which is to transform 100,000 wild spaces in the UK for people, butterflies and moths, so bringing people closer to nature through butterflies and moths. All of that is based upon the Lawton principles, which stems from the Lawton report back in 2010, which states that nature conservation should be bigger, better and more connected. And we've got the diagram on the screen here from the report at the far right, which shows those different elements of that. So you've got areas of restoration, landscape corridors to allow species to move, stepping stones where they're able to disperse across wider areas, your core areas of habitat, linear areas of habitat to connect places, and buffer zones to protect areas. And that's quite a simplified version of a landscape, and landscapes generally are a lot more complicated than that diagram, and we have to work with a number of different settings and species to get things right. And how we do that within BC is analysing what species are doing and what we know about species. And one of those key areas that we look at is that habitat size and occupation, as well as the quality and connectivity and the sustainability of that. And we analyse that in a spider diagram like the one on the screen. Now, this is an example of a large heath, not a species of the southeast of England. So we're currently sort of churning through all the different species, but this is a good example to show you change. So the blue being what was analysed in the first year of understanding this species, in which you can see that we've got limited knowledge. We're at a 4 here, and then going into year 2, we're now at an 8. We've got greater knowledge of this species. And the more that spider diagram expands the outer edges, the more that species is performing better in a landscape based upon our knowledge and the quality and connectivity of how that habitat is performing. You're probably thinking, why is this important? Why do we need landscapes for Lepidoptera? And all butterflies need different things for their life cycles. They need food plants for their caterpillars, nectar sources for the adults, warmth, shelter, and safe spaces for overwintering. And a lot of species can be particularly specific to what they want. So the example on the screen at the moment is the small blue, which of course only uses kidney vetch to lay its eggs. So a very niche life cycle, and some life cycles are more complex than that. And it shows in research that we have 68% of butterflies which rely on specific habitat need conservation help, which is quite an alarming statistic when you look at butterflies. And that's made worse by our moths, where research at Butterfly Conservation, alongside has shown 76% of butterflies have declined in their abundance or distribution since 1976, and larger moths 33% since 1968. So it's concerning. And those big threats can be categorized into sort of 3 main areas. One is climate change. Climate change has a double-edged sword. It is helping some species that are at the far north of their range, but it is also taking away from others that are that cannot cope in those conditions. You've also got the cessation of suitable management and land use change. So where either management is stopping and we're not enabling the turnover and succession for species to carry on, or there's a change in practice such as farming or agriculture. And then there's barriers to dispersal, where where the landscape becomes fragmented to the point that the species is no longer able to disperse along it, which creates a barrier for it to complete its life cycles, and also find genetic viability across a wide area. So why butterflies and moths? Butterflies and moths are increasingly being recognised as valuable environmental indicators, both for their rapid and sensitive responses to subtle habitat or climatic changes, as representatives of the diversity and responses of other wildlife. So in summary, these are species that we would call bioindicators. If something is going wrong with butterflies and moths, we know that something is severely wrong in the habitat, and that will have a knock-on effect for other species. So by monitoring butterflies and moths, we have a good idea of what is going on because of their sensitivity to change. And that makes them quite an important species when we assess habitats and ecosystems and landscapes. Butterfly conservation is fortunate to run sort of 3 of the largest butterfly and moth recording schemes in the world. And those schemes give us a great deal of information about what butterflies and moths are doing and enable us to apply science and applied ecology to that to help these species along. It unfortunately gets a little bit scarier that when you look at the latest research, so this is the 2022 Red List information, and if you look at the diagram, you can see that over 50% of UK species are of conservation concern. 4 already considered regionally extinct, 8 endangered, 16 vulnerable, and 5 near threatened, which just puts it into perspective how much our nature in the UK is at risk. So you're probably now wondering what it is we're doing at landscape scale to enhance for butterflies and moths. And one of the first things we have in butterfly conservation is our reserves. We've got a suite of reserves all around the southeast. We've got 5 that we look at in particular. Magdalen Down is probably butterfly conservation's premier reserve down in Hampshire, and is a wonderful chalk hillside landscape with lots of chalk assemblages such as small blue, Adonis blue, skippers, and occasionally other species, managed by traditional grazing and management techniques. So it's looked after by Fiona Scully, one of our landscape officers. And we use that as a centerpiece in that landscape to influence the land around us and other land managers, as we do with a lot of our other reserves. So over the other side of Winchester from Magdalen Hill down, we then have Yew Hill, which is in a more, from that photo, appears more rural. But you can just see housing at the edge of Winchester to the left of the photo. And this is an area that is at risk of development all around this space. So we use our reserves to put nature back into the landscapes and bring people closer to nature. Bringing people closer to nature through our reserves is a key element of our work, given that 73% of people find that connecting with nature gives them a mental health boost. And that's quite a powerful statistic when you think that our nature reserves are just dotted islands in landscapes. When you look at a landscape whole and try and join that up as a connected bubble, all as one integrated system of different pieces of habitat coming together, that's quite a good impact that you can get for people as well as nature. So we have 3 more reserves down in the other side of Hampshire, to the north of the South Downs National Park. We have Bentley Station Meadow, which is on the edge of Alice Holt Forest. Great place to see some of your woodland species of butterflies, such as purple emperor that live on the sallows of the reserve, along with some open meadow species and a few other woodland edge things such as white admiral and silverwash fritillary. We also have Park Corner Heath and Rowland Woods. So this reserve is a combination of heathland open grassland and ancient woodland with pause restoration, so plantation restoration site. This site is quite famous for its pearl-bordered fritillaries. Pearl-bordered fritillaries are one of those species which currently live in the southeast of England we don't consider to be using landscapes effectively, and that's partly because they are suffering majorly with climate change and different conditions. So these warmer, wetter winters that we're experiencing is not providing the conditions that we once had for this species. And that therefore encourages the grass and the scrub and the coppice to grow back much quicker than we've seen in previous years. And therefore that shades out the violets that they need for their food plant. So that one key thing that they need within their very bespoke life cycle is taken away from them much quicker in order to survive. And the populations in Sussex are clinging on a few sites, limited number of sites, but they're no longer able to use that full landscape. So we have to firefight these populations to get them back into good, healthy order in order to then disperse at scale across the landscape. The last reserve we have, and the one most relevant to Surrey, is Oakenwood, and we manage this site in partnership with Forestry England. You'll notice the Bethany is front and centre of this photo, and that is because this is the only site in the UK known for Bethany casebearer, and I'll talk a bit more about those later on, but also very much known for its wood white. And again, this is another site that is very much at the centre of a much bigger landscape in which we hope to influence other landowners and managers to make a difference for species at scale. So you're probably now wondering, I've spoken about all these little reserves and these little pockets in the landscape, but yet landscapes are much bigger elements, and we have quite a few landscapes within the southeast of England. This is just a map to give you an indication, all of which has its own individual character and different things that we focus on within those landscapes. And you'll notice on there are some urban landscapes where we want to bring people closer to nature as well as deliver conservation objectives, and other landscapes that are particularly important to specific groups or individual species. So, for example, the Bleanwoods complex in Kent to the east of the diagram is very much a place where we focus on heath fritillary as a stronghold for them in the southeast of England, as well as other landscapes on there, such as the South Downs, where we're working on chalk assemblages and Duke of Burgundy, all the way up to the northern clay vales and Yardley Whittlewood, where we're focusing on the 5 Hare Streaks assemblage and wood white as well. So there's a broad range of landscapes, each bringing different factors that are needed for butterflies and moths, but not necessarily always performing how they should do, due to human intervention or changes in how those landscapes are managed, or indeed climate change. So we have to go in and help the species out by doing a number of different things. So some of the species that we're working on, particularly at the moment, are governed by our strategy. So we have a list of 71 species. Within that, some of the 4 top butterfly priorities are Duke of Burgundy, pearl-bordered fritillary, wood white, and heath fritillary, each with their own individual requirements. And a lot of these species share in common that they are species of succession. They're temporary species. And by saying they're species of succession and species that are temporary, they're species that like habitat in a mid-phase of development. It doesn't necessarily want tall woodland. It doesn't necessarily want open grassland, but it likes those areas in the middle. So in the case of heath fritillary, for example, this relies on cowwheat as its food plant and will come in response to woodland management. Where light is able to get to the floor, cowwheat grows up and it's able to come in and colonize to complete its life cycle. And it's known for following the woodman around the wood historically, between its different coppice coops and along woodland rides where there's continuity of habitat for it. The wood white, having wood in its name, likes those broader open woodland clearings and rides. So traditionally managed woodlands suit this species really well, whereas the cessation of management post-World War has seen distinct reductions in both heath fritillary and woodwhite because that woodland management has stopped. And you can see similar trends with pearl border fritillary and Duke of Burgundy, where they need those openings of habitat to occur. Duke of Burgundy is an interesting species and it will occur on short grassland, but traditionally has also occurred in woodland clearings. The majority of Duke of Burgundies that we work on in the southeast of England are chalk grassland associated, but they are not on what you would call pristine chalk grass, and they're utilising scrub that is coming at a stage of mid-succession, and they're using that scrub dynamic. Particularly, you see males, as this example here, perched up on the top of that scrub, patrolling its habitat, waiting for a female to come along and take advantage of that to spread its genetics. Which means it's not looking for pristine grassland either, so therefore vulnerable to modern practices such as overgrazing or mechanical means of scrub cutting that can potentially be harmful towards them. So we need to find the right balance in each of the habitats for these species. And these are some of the more complex species that we deal with when we're looking at landscapes. Others can be more generalist, but they still need to have those individual aspects provided for them in order to complete their life cycles and move onwards. But it's not just all about the butterflies. We have to look at moths as well. And we're fortunate that we're coming to the end of our Heritage Lottery funding with the Kent Magnificent Moths project that we've had over the last 3 years. So we're very grateful to the Heritage Lottery. And that's focused on purely on Kent, in looking at 3 of our particular landscapes. So the Kent Cliffs and Downs, around the Rumney and Dungeness marshes, and also slightly inland up on the North Downs. All of these species that we've got on the screen, so we've got Sussex Emerald, Fisher's Estuarine Moth, Marshmallow, Bright Wave, Blackfang Moth, Fiery Clearing, White-spotted Sabre and Strawbell, have all throughout this project benefited not just from habitat management, but also from survey to identify where they're going in that landscape, what they're doing and what they're using. And Rebecca, our conservation officer on this project, has been fortunate enough to identify new trends in where this species is located, and also different quirks to their phenology that we didn't previously know, to understand where they're going and what they're doing. Which has that knock-on effect, because if we don't know what they're doing and where they're going, we need to increase our knowledge of them. How can we manage for them? So a lot of the first steps in our landscape approach is to do that survey and understanding of what these species are doing, where they're going, and necessarily, because we don't always know, what keeps them ticking on. What bits of their phenology or ecology are we missing that we need to understand in order to conserve them? And we've been fortunate that through that project, we've been able to deliver results at scale for these moths in those landscapes. It doesn't always work out that way. And Bethany Case Bear is one example I brought in here. And this is one that's found at the Oakenwood Reserve. But at the moment, that's the only place in the country that we know that it exists. So a lot of that work going into researching for them is looking at that wider landscape and seeing what works well in habitat and what doesn't work well, and can we find them elsewhere and encourage them to utilize wider habitat. So a lot of the species that we deal with can be quite complex. But then when you're looking at a landscape in general on a much broader scale with a lot more going on, the more generalist species and some of these species that are more mobile, such as the small blue I spoke about earlier, will utilize much larger areas without as much conservation input, but it still relies on traditional habitat management techniques, or even some more modern techniques being put in place to keep them ticking on. And that still relies on a whole host of mechanisms to keep people on track with that. So what are we doing at the moment? Currently, we've got a whole range of work across the southeast of England that's employed to target specific landscapes and specific species. The first is the western low-wheeled landscape, which is the most relevant example to Surrey, centred around the Chiddingfold complex and that Oakham Wood Reserve, where we're looking at the conservation of wood white, the Bettany casebearer, and hopefully this year we're going to have a look for white-spotted sable. Notoriously, a species very hard to find because as an adult it can disperse at quite low densities. So therefore, the current research shows that from our applied ecology team that it's much easier to find this species as caterpillars, which is very labour intensive work for myself and my team, as we have to go around and first record the food plant, which is goldenrod, and it's at good enough densities to be able to then go back to that at the right time of year to locate the caterpillars of that moth. And then once we've done that, we know where it is, we know what it's doing, we can get an idea of what habitat suitability it requires. We then can look at replicating that along a much wider area to let it utilise the whole of the landscape. Wood white, however, is a more robust example. We know what it requires. We know it needs vetches to complete its life cycle, and it needs those nice broad woodland rides. So this is a species that historically has suffered from that decline in management, as well as a few other factors such as mechanisation of management, speeding up the process, meaning that everything's done at once. So this is a species that's used to slower paces of change, but also open habitat being maintained in order to complete its life cycle. So when we look at this example, a lot of our work then focuses around the advocacy to different landowners and managers in order to facilitate what this species needs to utilise the landscape as a whole, to join up colonies and to form coherent populations at scale. This is a species you may think, well, it can fly as a butterfly, but actually although it has quite a direct flight up and down woodland rides, is not one that really likes to go very high. It's not one that will go over a large stand of conifer over to the next suitable bit of habitat. You may get the odd one or two, but what it wants is that nice continuity of dapple shaded habitat throughout a larger woodland complex and out into other habitat in the wider landscape. So this is a species that first got a lot of work through the dedication of volunteers at Surrey Branch, and then into the Wood White project, which ended just after the pandemic. And now we're trying to pick that back up with our new landscape officer in post for this area, Richard, who is getting stuck in, as Bill and other members of the branch know, to doing a lot of work in this landscape. The other big major landscape work on is the South Downs National Park, and particularly focused towards the western end of that, where there is a number of Duke of Burgundy colonies. And we're working with landowners to ensure the correct management for these species, along with other chalk grass and assemblages, where we use our Magdalen Hill Down Reserve as a showcase point for how to manage for those species. Duke of Burgundy currently absent from that site, but in terms of chalk grass and assemblages, it's a reserve that holds all of those very well and is able to demonstrate good management techniques. We're able to use our influence in the landscape to talk to a wide number of people about these species and get them moving through the landscape. And a lot of the techniques that we use can be quite simple, or there can be a lot more advanced options when it comes to the skill of land managers and looking at grazing regimes and how scrub cutting cycles are done. One of the other landscapes that's received a lot of recent work, as I've mentioned, is those pearl border fritillaries. We're yet again looking for white-spotted sable here, and that's part of a much bigger joined-up effort around the country to focus on the phenology of this moth. We know it behaves differently in the south to it does in the north of England, so therefore we're putting a bit more effort into the applied ecology of this species. And we don't currently have records for Surrey and Sussex beyond those that are historic, so we're hoping to go back and hopefully find some more recent records, as well as firefight pearl border fritillary at those individual sites, to then hopefully bring them back to a more coherent landscape scale approach. And we're also working on heath fritillary in the Blean. The heath fritillary is a species that's been worked on by butterfly conservation for a very long period of time, Butterfly conservation has helped to bring this species back from the edge of extinction in the UK. And it's now hoped that through work in the Bleam with a range of landowners, we can continue to monitor this species to help advise landowners in what they need to do to keep this species afloat. So we use a range of techniques to do this. We start with landscape planning and mapping, looking at where these species are, what they're doing, and then can we get a grip on what they need and how can we implement that? Who do we need to talk to and what do we need to do that? We target species through survey and research. One, to find out where they are, but as I've said with white-spotted sable, we need to understand them more, what they're doing, what is their phenology, what is their ecology, in order to best conserve them at scale. And then we could bring about targeted interventions, and this may vary depending on species to species. Planting is quite a simple one, depending on your habitat types and the requirements of the plant required by the species. I've already mentioned the example of small blue, but another more generalist species that we find in our landscapes, particularly when we look at the Northern Clay Vales landscape up above the Chilterns, because that's one we focus on, looking at hair streaks, because that's one of the places in the UK where you can find all 5 naturally occurring together. Is the planting of disease-resistant Dutch elm trees to keep white letter hair streak moving, alongside looking at the continuity and quality of blackthorn stands for things like black and brown hair streak. We can also use scrapes for a range of species. So we come in and we remove the nutrient-rich topsoil to reset the ground in order to then keep it nutrient poor and sow wildflower seeds for some species, such as small blue, chalk-hill blue, for example. Or in other cases, we're putting in scrapes that enables ants to colonize so that species are able to effectively complete their life cycles in relation to other invertebrates. So in the case of the silver-studded blue that we've got on the screen at the moment, this is a species with a complex life cycle, where for a stage of its life, it is adopted by ants, taken down into the ants' nest and looked after, before then emerging as an adult butterfly the following year. So all of a sudden, this landscape focus on butterflies switches, and we're now looking at a landscape approach for ants. Are we creating the right condition for a different invertebrate in order to support butterflies? So it can be surprising what you come up with along the way when you're looking at what these species require in order to operate at landscape scale. And often you'll find with some of these species that it's where that management has stopped or the management's changed, where the one little bit of their life cycle that can't be completed is missing, is where you see the largest declines, and sometimes that could be the hardest factor to work out. And one of the more difficult management things we can do as a targeted intervention is adaptations to management. And that could include grazing regimes, or it can include coppicing cycles. There's a whole different range of techniques we can use. But often that has to be tailored to individual land managers and the resource available to them and the cost behind that. So you have to think quite carefully and be quite thrifty and knowledgeable of your species in order to get the correct outcome you want for it to perform at landscape within the constraints that we've got. We know that conservation as an industry, as a practice, doesn't have always the great level of funding that it needs to deliver the targets that we want and those aspirations. So we have to be very mindful of that when we're delivering advice. And the best thing you can do is deliver simple habitat management advice that is effective and can be met by the resources available to those landowners. And we've got some effective cases of that, particularly in the South Downs, where our project officer there, Fiona, is working with farm clusters to develop habitat and monitoring on a wide range of species that are able to then utilize that landscape because of the adaptations that she is implementing with them, with the resources that they have available. So there's a lot that has to be considered. Now, with all that in mind, you're probably thinking, well, how do we then measure success, and it's done on quite a varied level. And we have this little diagram here, which is our landscape recovery curve model. And we start down at zone 1. And zone 1 is where we're perhaps working for species at a couple of areas of landscape. So a couple of different locations. It's not particularly joined up. It's not particularly coherent. Zone 2 is where we introduce those principles that I spoke about at the beginning of the presentation, where we look at the Lawton principles. How can we make this conservation bigger, better, and more connected, utilizing all those different aspects that I've spoken about to get that species to perform well at landscape level. Where that then changes into zones 3 and 4 is the most crucial, because throughout the whole time in zone 1 and 2, butterfly conservation and its volunteers and partners are driving that work. And we are the main impetus to why those species are doing well at landscape. As soon as you move to 3 and 4 is how you achieve sustainability in that landscape recovery, because you're beginning to get other partners to take on that work. So number 3, we're working in partnership with other people, and working in partnership is crucial to saving species at landscape level, because we can't own whole landscapes as one nature reserve. It's possible, and we can't manage it all, and there's a number of different landowners involved. So therefore, you have to work with everyone in a landscape to bring about a coordinated approach to delivering our work. And zone 4 is where we start to step back. People are enthused about species. They're wanting to make that difference, and they're making that change on their own. And we're now just on the edge providing advice. And we want to move all of our landscapes through to that zone 4 stage where they're able to perform coherently for species, with butterfly conservation advising people on the side about what they're doing for those species in that landscape, and knitting it all together as that coherent piece. But it doesn't necessarily all have to fit as one big aspirational model as the landscape. We sometimes have to focus more closely at individual species, like I mentioned with the white-spotted sable and some of those other moths from the Kent Magnificent Moths project. We're not quite sure what the declines are, and we look at a more complex model, which is the Natural England Species Recovery Curve. All the steps are on the bottom, but essentially you can categorize this down into why is it going wrong? What is it that we need to work out that's happening with this species to cause its decline? We then need to look at potential solutions to why that's going wrong and bring about the solution development. How can we refine those species so that those species techniques, management techniques, in order to bring it back up the curve, back into a coherent state across a landscape, or it back into recovery on individual sites. At point 8, it starts recovering. And then at 9, you reach sustainable management, where management can be achieved and the species is beginning to recover. And we've seen this with a lot of species. So when we look back at the red list, for example, Duke of Burgundy, although a species that remains of conservation concern, this is a species where direct conservation input has actually benefited and increased the numbers of this species and enabled it to move at landscape scale and be a more coherent species that is moving away from decline. So quite often we start with this diagram here, and we have to work through individual species. What are their needs? What is the cause of their decline? How can we sustainably manage for them before we then go back to the landscape recovery curve and actually get them to then move around a much broader landscape? I hope that's served as a bit of an overview to butterfly conservation's work in the southeast of England and how we work at landscape scale to bring about change for butterflies and moths. There's a whole broad range of different aspects and different things that we could go into, and I hope that this has served as a bit of a higher level overview of those different aspects brought together for your viewing. And if you have any questions about different projects or different works, I'll be happy to answer those at the end. I'll hand back to Simon.